The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning fog like a rusty blade. "Unit 47, folks. Harold Grimm's belongings. Starting bid is $50. Maya pressed her palm against her lower back, trying to ease the persistent ache that had become her constant companion. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her anxiety. 8 months pregnant and sitting on a plastic chair in a storage facility parking lot. This wasn't exactly the vision she'd had for her life at 32. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer, a weathered man named Pete, who'd been running these auctions for 20 years, peered over his glasses at the small crowd. Most were regulars Maya had started recognizing over the past 3 months: Tommy, the antique dealer, Sarah, who specialized in vintage clothes, and Big Jim, who bought anything with metal he could scrap. Maya raised her hand. 50. 50 from the lady in the blue jacket. Do I hear 75? She studied the unit from her position 20 feet away. The door was rolled up just enough to reveal the bottom few feet of Harold's possessions. She could make out what looked like military surplus boxes, some camping gear, and the edge of what might be a gun safe. Her heart rate quickened. Gun safes often meant valuable firearms, and valuable firearms meant enough money to cover her rent, utilities, and maybe even a dent in the medical bills that seemed to multiply like cancer cells. 75, called Big Jim, scratching his grey beard. Maya's stomach clenched. She'd learned the hard way that going over budget was a luxury she couldn't afford. Last month, she'd bid $250 on a unit that looked promising and walked away with nothing but moldy furniture and worthless electronics. She'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for 2 weeks straight. 100, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The baby shifted again, pressing against her bladder. She needed to use the restroom, but leaving now meant losing the unit. She thought about David, about how he used to tease her for her competitive streak when they played board games. "You've got that look, Maya," he'd say, grinning, "the one that means you're about to destroy me at Scrabble." God, she missed him. Missed his terrible jokes during late-night lab sessions, missed the way he'd bring her coffee exactly the way she liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream. Missed having someone who understood why she'd spend hours analyzing water samples, why she cared so much about documenting the recovery patterns of marine ecosystems. The irony wasn't lost on her that David's death in the lab accident had destroyed her financially just as thoroughly as it had emotionally. The experimental equipment malfunction that killed him also triggered a cascade of lawsuits, insurance disputes, and medical bills that her modest professor's salary could never cover. 125 from Big Jim. Do I hear 150? Maya looked at the crumpled bills in her hand. 200 left after her $100 bid. If she went higher and lost, she'd have wasted money she couldn't spare. If she went higher and won, she'd have less capital to work with for reselling whatever she found. But something about Unit 47 felt different. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the same intuition that had guided her research, the ability to sense when she was on the verge of something significant. 150, she called out. Pete nodded. 150 from the pregnant lady. Jim, you going higher? Big Jim shook his head and stepped back. Maya felt a flutter of relief. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder 47 for $150. As the small crowd dispersed, Maya struggled to stand, one hand on her lower back, the other accepting the congratulations and good-natured ribbing from the other bidders. She paid Pete in cash and received the bolt cutters and her receipt. Walking toward Unit 47, she felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread that had become routine over the past few months. Each unit was a gamble, and she was playing with money she couldn't afford to lose. But she was also playing for stakes higher than most of the other bidders realized, not just profit, but survival. The metal door rattled as she pulled it up, revealing Harold Grimm's carefully organized world. The first thing she noticed was how clean everything was. No dust, no cobwebs, no smell of mildew that plagued most abandoned units. Harold had been meticulous. Military surplus boxes were stacked along one wall, each labeled with precise handwriting. Camping equipment hung from hooks, sleeping bags, backpacks, what looked like expensive outdoor gear. The gun safe she'd spotted was indeed there, a serious piece of equipment that suggested Harold had owned valuable firearms. But it was the far corner that caught her attention, a series of white containers, the kind used for scientific specimens. Maya's marine biology training kicked in automatically. She recognized laboratory-grade storage when she saw it. Her pulse quickened for reasons that had nothing to do with pregnancy or money troubles. Those containers looked exactly like the ones she'd used in her research. What had Harold Grimm been collecting? Maya stepped into the unit, her sneakers silent on the concrete floor. The November chill seemed less biting inside, as if Harold's meticulous organization had somehow insulated the space against decay. She moved carefully around the stacked boxes, her belly brushing against a camping chair that probably cost more than she'd spent on groceries in the past month. The specimen containers drew her like a magnet. 5 white polyethylene cases, each about the size of a tackle box, arranged on a metal shelf with military precision. The labels were typed, not handwritten like everything else. Pacific Northwest Marine Samples, HG, authorized personnel only. Maya's fingers hovered over the nearest container. In her old life, the life where David brought her coffee and she had a laboratory to call home, she would have opened it immediately. Scientific curiosity had always been stronger than caution. But that woman had the luxury of tenure-track security and health insurance. This woman, 8 months pregnant and living on borrowed time, couldn't afford to satisfy curiosity that might complicate a simple resale transaction. She forced herself to turn away and inventory the obvious moneymakers first. The gun safe was a Browning, probably worth $300 alone, even without knowing what was inside. The camping gear bore tags from REI and Patagonia, expensive brands that would move quickly on Facebook Marketplace. Harold hadn't been a casual outdoorsman. He'd been someone who bought the best equipment and took care of it. The military surplus boxes contained what she expected: MREs still within their expiration dates, water purification tablets, emergency medical supplies, navigation equipment. Preppers paid good money for this stuff. She could probably clear $400 profit, maybe $5 if the gun safe contained anything valuable. But the specimen containers nagged at her. She found herself drifting back to them, drawn by a professional instinct that 3 months of financial desperation hadn't managed to kill. The labels included GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude markers, for locations she didn't recognize but instinctively knew were coastal based on the formatting. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carol, her former research partner, department meeting today about the new marine protection grant. Wish you were here. Coffee later? Maya stared at the message, feeling the familiar ache of loss that had nothing to do with David and everything to do with the life she'd been forced to abandon. Carol was probably sitting in Maya's old office right now, analyzing data from the kelp forest restoration project they'd started together. Maya should have been there, should have been fighting for grant money to expand their research into marine ecosystem recovery patterns. Instead, she was standing in a dead stranger's storage unit, trying to figure out how much she could get for his emergency flares. The baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp. She'd been on her feet too long. The smart thing would be to load everything into her Honda Civic, everything except the specimen containers, which were probably just rock samples or water quality measurements anyway, sell what she could, pay this month's rent, and try to build up enough cushion to survive the first few months after the baby arrived. But as she reached for the first military surplus box, her eyes caught something else. A journal tucked between 2 containers, bound in water-resistant material. Harold's handwriting on the cover read Field Notes, 2024, Classification Personal. Maya's hands moved before her brain could stop them. She opened the journal to a random page and felt her breath catch. The sketches were precise, scientific, drawn with the attention to detail she recognized from her own field notebooks. But these weren't drawings of typical Pacific Northwest marine life. The creature on the page looked like a seal, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, The skull shape didn't match any species she knew. Harold's notes filled the margins. Observed 0800 HRs, approximately 200 meters offshore, Point Reyes area. Subject displayed unusual feeding behavior, diving patterns inconsistent with known species. She flipped forward a few pages. More sketches, more notes, GPS coordinates that placed Harold at remote locations up and down the Oregon and Northern California coast. The handwriting grew increasingly excited as the entries progressed. Obtained photographic evidence, and skeletal analysis confirms preliminary identification, and, most intriguingly, population appears stable despite official classification. Official classification of what? Maya's marine biology training had taught her to recognize species identification notes, and Harold's observations read like someone documenting animals that weren't supposed to exist. The baby kicked again, and reality crashed back. She was 8 months pregnant, standing in a storage unit she'd bought with money she couldn't afford to lose, reading the field notes of a dead stranger when she should be loading merchandise into her car. But as she closed the journal, her eyes fell on a photograph tucked into the back cover. A seal-like creature on a rocky shore, photographed with a telephoto lens. The image quality was excellent, the detail sharp enough to see individual whiskers. In the bottom right corner, Harold had written a date, September 15th, 2024, last confirmed sighting. 6 weeks ago. Harold Grimm had been documenting something 6 weeks ago, something that looked like no seal species Maya had ever studied. And now Harold was dead, and his secrets were sitting in her storage unit, waiting. Maya stared at the photograph until her vision blurred. The creature's eyes seemed almost human in their intelligence, and the distinctive coloring, darker around the muzzle, lighter patches behind what should have been typical seal flippers, matched no pinnipped in any taxonomy she'd memorized during graduate school. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Carol. Maya Chen? The voice was crisp, professional, tinged with authority that made her stomach clench even before she processed the words. This is Agent Rebecca Torres with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We understand you've recently acquired some materials that belong to Harold Grimm. Maya's mouth went dry. She looked around the storage unit, suddenly feeling exposed despite the privacy walls. How did you get this number? The auction house provided bidder information. We'd like to speak with you about Mr. Grimm's research materials. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? Research materials, not hunting equipment, not camping gear. Research. I don't understand, Maya said, though part of her absolutely did understand. Harold hadn't been a weekend outdoorsman collecting trophy photos. He'd been conducting systematic field research, documenting something the government apparently cared about. I bought a storage unit. I don't know anything about research. Nevertheless, we'd appreciate a conversation. There are some items of federal interest that may have been improperly retained. The line went dead. Maya stood frozen, the journal still open in her hands. Federal interest. She thought about the GPS coordinates in Harold's notes, wondered if any of them fell within marine sanctuaries or protected waters. Wondered what improperly retained meant when applied to photographs of animals that shouldn't exist. She should pack everything back up right now. Call Agent Torres back, arrange to hand over whatever they wanted, walk away clean. She had enough problems without adding federal investigators to her life. But the scientist in her, the part that David had always said was her best and most dangerous quality, whispered different advice. She flipped through more pages of the journal, finding increasingly detailed observations. Harold's methodology was sound, his documentation thorough. These weren't the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist or amateur cryptozoologist. They read like legitimate field research. On page 47, she found what made her hands tremble. A detailed anatomical sketch labeled Caribbean monk seal, Neomonachus tropicalis, living specimen. Below it, Harold had written, officially extinct, 1952. Population estimate, 15 to 20 individuals observed in protected cove system, Northern California. Evidence suggests successful breeding pairs. Maya's breathing became shallow. The Caribbean monk seal had been declared extinct 70 years ago, hunted to oblivion by fishermen and seal oil hunters. She'd written a paper about it in graduate school, part of a larger study on anthropogenic extinctions in marine mammals. The last confirmed sighting was in 1952, but Harold's notes were dated 3 months ago. She opened the first specimen container with shaking hands. Inside, wrapped in archival tissue paper, was a single tooth, massive, worn, unmistakably from a marine mammal. The root structure was wrong for any living seal species, the size inconsistent with modern pinnipeds, but it matched perfectly with Stella's sea cow dental remains she'd seen in museum collections. Stella's sea cow, extinct since 1768. The second container held bone fragments, carefully labeled and catalogued. Maya's trained eye recognized rib sections, vertebrae, what looked like a partial skull. The morphology was familiar yet impossible, features that belonged to animals that hadn't existed for centuries. Her phone rang again. "Maya, honey, how are you feeling?" Her mother's voice, warm and concerned from 3,000 miles away in Boston. "I was thinking about you this morning. Is everything okay? You sound strange." "I'm fine, Mom." The lie came automatically, even as Maya stared at photographic evidence of creatures that science said were extinct. "Just tired." "Are you sure? You know, it's not too late to come home. Your father and I could help with the baby. You wouldn't have to do this storage auction thing." "I can't abandon everything here." Maya touched her belly, feeling the baby's restless movement. "David's buried here. Our life was here. But David would want you to be safe. He wouldn't want you struggling like this." "Safe?" Maya almost laughed. 3 hours ago, her biggest worry had been making rent. Now she was holding evidence that could rewrite marine biology textbooks, while federal agents wanted to question her about improperly retained materials. "I have to go, Mom. I love you." She hung up and stared at Harold's journal, at the impossible photographs, at the specimen containers that represented either the discovery of a lifetime or the beginning of something dangerous. In 6 hours, she was supposed to meet with Agent Torres. She could hand everything over, walk away, go back to her simple plan of survival through resale profits. She could investigate. Find out what Harold had really discovered, what the coordinates in his journal led to, why the government cared enough to track down a pregnant woman in a storage unit. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her agitation. Maya pressed her palm against the movement, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since David's death. She needed to think about safety, about stability, about creating a secure future for her child. But she also thought about David, about his passion for discovery, about the way his eyes lit up when they'd found something unexpected in their research. Maya Chen closed the journal and faced her choice. Maya sat in her Honda Civic outside the storage facility, hands gripping the steering wheel, Harold's journal and one specimen container on the passenger seat beside her. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, engine off, watching the fog roll in from the Columbia River, while her mind churned through possibilities that all seemed to end badly. The smart choice was obvious. Drive to the federal building downtown, hand everything over to Agent Torres, apologize for any confusion, and walk away. She could still salvage the camping equipment and military surplus from the unit, still make enough profit to cover rent and groceries, still build towards some kind of stable future for her and the baby. But the Stella's sea cow tooth sat in its archival wrapping like a question she couldn't ignore. If Harold's documentation was accurate, if these creatures were actually alive in remote Pacific waters, she was holding evidence of the greatest conservation discovery in modern history, species that science had mourned as lost forever, surviving in secret for decades or even centuries. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Rent due tomorrow. Need to discuss payment plan if you're having issues." Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of accumulated debts, unpaid medical bills, and the approaching reality of single motherhood pressing down like the November fog. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to think beyond the next month's expenses. Harold's research offered a glimpse of something larger, something that mattered beyond her immediate financial crisis, but it also offered danger she couldn't quantify. The baby shifted restlessly, and Maya wondered if her stress was affecting her daughter, because she was certain it was a girl, despite refusing the ultrasound technician's offer to confirm. David had been convinced too, had already started calling the baby our little marine biologist and joking about buying her a microscope for her first birthday. David would have opened every container, photographed every specimen, and started planning research expeditions before Agent Torres had finished her phone call. His enthusiasm for discovery had been infectious, dangerous, and ultimately what made him push experimental protocols too far in a lab that wasn't properly equipped for the risks he was taking. Maya's throat tightened. Was she romanticizing his memory? David's passion had also left her alone, pregnant and drowning in the financial aftermath of his choices. His little marine biologist would grow up without knowing her father's laugh, his terrible puns about fish anatomy, his way of making even the most mundane research feel like adventure. She opened the journal to Harold's GPS coordinates, using her phone to map the locations. Remote coastal areas in Oregon, Northern California, some offshore coordinates that would require boat access. Harold had been methodical, systematic, visiting the same locations repeatedly over months of observation. The pattern suggested someone tracking animal movements, documenting behavior, building a scientific case for something extraordinary. If she followed Harold's coordinates, she could verify his findings, gather additional evidence, build an airtight case before revealing anything publicly, but that would mean weeks of field work, travel expenses she couldn't afford, time away from income-generating activities, while her savings dwindled toward zero. And it would mean lying to federal agents about what she'd found. Maya's hands moved to her belly as another strong kick reminded her of the stakes. She wasn't just making choices for herself anymore. Every decision carried the weight of another life, another future she was responsible for protecting. The responsible choice was stability, safety, compliance with authority, but as she flipped through Harold's careful documentation, she kept thinking about the expression in that seal's eyes, the intelligence there, the suggestion of awareness that transcended simple animal behavior. If Harold was right, if these creatures had survived against impossible odds, what did humanity owe them? What did she owe them as a marine biologist, even a former one? Her phone rang. Agent Torres. Miss Chen, I wanted to confirm our meeting time. 4 o'clock at the federal building? Maya stared at the journal, at the evidence of impossible survival, at the choice that would define everything that came next. Actually, I'm not feeling well. The pregnancy. Could we postpone until tomorrow? A pause. Of course. Are you experiencing any complications? Do you need medical attention? No, just tired. Tomorrow would be better. Very well. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. And Miss Chen, please don't disturb any materials from the storage unit until we've had our conversation. The line went dead, leaving Maya with 12 hours to decide whether Harold Grimm's secret was worth risking everything she had left. The fog was thickening, turning the familiar streets of Astoria into something mysterious and uncertain. Just like Harold's photographs, she realized. Familiar creatures made strange by impossible circumstances, challenging everything she thought she knew about survival, extinction, and the boundaries between hope and delusion. Maya started the engine and drove home, carrying Harold's secrets and her own growing certainty that tomorrow's conversation would change everything, one way or another. The drive home, through thickening fog, felt like traveling through a dreamscape where familiar landmarks emerged and disappeared like half-remembered theories. Maya's apartment building materialized from the grey veil, a converted Victorian that had seen better decades, its peeling paint and sagging porch steps a constant reminder of her reduced circumstances. She parked in her assigned spot, Harold's journal pressed against her chest like a talisman. 12 hours. She had 12 hours before Agent Torres would expect answers, explanations, compliance. 12 hours to decide whether Maya Chen would remain a former marine biologist, scraping by on storage unit auctions, or become something else entirely. Inside her studio apartment, Maya spread Harold's materials across her small kitchen table, the same table where she'd once graded undergraduate papers about marine ecosystems, back when her future felt limitless and secure. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to make the most important scientific decision of her life on a surface scarred by years of financial anxiety, marked with ring stains from coffee cups consumed while calculating how to stretch grocery budgets. She opened her laptop, its startup chime a familiar comfort in the strange new reality Harold had thrust upon her. Her fingers moved automatically to marine biology databases, professional journals, taxonomy records she hadn't accessed since David's death. The login credentials still worked, though her university library access had expired months ago. Another small death, another severed connection to the life she'd built. But tonight, she needed those connections. Maya cross-referenced Harold's GPS coordinates with known marine-protected areas, shipping lanes, research station locations. His observation points were carefully chosen, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, positioned near deep-water channels where large marine mammals might travel undetected. Harold hadn't been wandering coastlines hoping for lucky encounters. He'd been conducting systematic surveillance based on scientific methodology. The baby kicked hard enough to knock her breath short. Maya pressed both palms to her belly, feeling the insistent rhythm of a daughter who seemed to respond to her mother's elevated heart rate with increasingly vigorous protests. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "This is crazy. Your daddy would say I'm being reckless." But David wasn't here to offer his opinion, and Maya was tired of making every choice based on fear of what might go wrong. 8 months of survival mode had taught her that safety was often an illusion anyway. Medical bills accumulated regardless of how carefully she budgeted. Landlords demanded rent whether she took risks or played it safe. The future remained uncertain no matter how many precautions she took. Harold's research offered something else, purpose beyond mere survival. Maya opened a new document and began typing, her marine biology training asserting itself as she structured her thoughts into proper scientific methodology. If she was going to investigate Harold's claims, she needed a research plan, not a treasure hunt. She outlined systematic approaches to evidence verification, documented her initial observations of Harold's specimens, established protocols for field investigation that would either confirm or debunk his extraordinary documentation. The familiar rhythm of scientific thinking felt like coming home after months of exile. This was who she'd been before tragedy reduced her world to immediate necessities. This was the part of herself she'd thought might be gone forever, buried under debt and exhaustion and the practical requirements of single motherhood. By midnight, Maya had mapped Harold's coordinates, researched optimal observation conditions based on tidal patterns and weather forecasts, and calculated the minimum equipment needed for preliminary field verification. The financial analysis made her stomach clench. Gas money, camping equipment rental, specialized camera gear to document anything she might find. Money she absolutely didn't have, spent on an investigation that might prove Harold was delusional. But if he wasn't delusional, if Caribbean monk seals were actually breeding in hidden Pacific coves, if Stella's sea cows had somehow survived centuries of presumed extinction. Maya's phone rang at 12:47 a.m., unknown number. "Miss Chen?" The voice was gravelly, older, unfamiliar. "This is Dr. Marcus Webb. I worked with Harold Grimm before his death. I understand you've acquired his research materials." Maya's pulse spiked. "How did you get this number?" "Harold left instructions. If anything happened to him, I was to contact whoever inherited his work. We need to meet. The government already wants to meet with me. I don't know what Harold was involved in, but—" "Harold wasn't involved in anything except documenting the impossible," Dr. Webb interrupted. "And if Torres is already sniffing around, we're running out of time." Harold died before he could publish his findings. You're holding evidence that certain parties would prefer never see daylight. Maya stared at Harold's photographs spread across her table, at creatures that shouldn't exist photographed with scientific precision. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves extinction isn't always forever, the kind that could revolutionize everything we thought we knew about marine conservation, but only if it reaches the right people before the wrong people bury it permanently. The line went dead, leaving Maya alone with her choice. At 1 a.m., she started packing. Maya's hands moved with mechanical precision, folding clothes and gathering supplies while her mind reeled from Dr. Webb's cryptic warning. The baby protested each sudden movement, kicks punctuating her mother's anxiety like an internal alarm system. She packed her laptop, Harold's journal, and the specimen containers into her old marine research backpack, the same bag that had accompanied her on countless field expeditions before her world contracted to storage units and unpaid bills. By 3 a.m., she was driving north on Highway 101, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness toward Harold's first coordinate location. The radio offered only static and late-night talk shows discussing conspiracy theories that seemed mundane compared to her current reality. Maya had left a voicemail for Agent Torres claiming food poisoning, buying herself perhaps 24 hours before her absence triggered federal attention. The gas gauge needle hovered near empty, but Maya couldn't afford to fill the tank until her credit card reset at midnight. Another small humiliation in a life full of them, measuring every decision against her dwindling resources while potentially carrying evidence that could rewrite scientific textbooks. Dawn found her parked at a deserted overlook above Cannon Beach, Harold's journal open to detailed observations about anomalous acoustic signatures detected from this exact position. Maya trained her binoculars on the churning grey waters below, searching for anything unusual among the normal parade of harbor seals and seabirds. The Oregon coast stretched endlessly in both directions, a frontier that still held secrets despite centuries of human exploration. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Observation Point Alpha, 6 a.m., black Jeep Cherokee. Maya's breath caught as she spotted the vehicle pulling into the overlook's gravel lot. Dr. Marcus Webb emerged slowly, a tall man in his 70s with wild grey hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades handling marine specimens. "Miss Chen?" His voice carried the same gravelly quality from their phone conversation, but his eyes held a sharpness that reminded Maya of her graduate advisor, someone accustomed to seeing patterns others missed. "Harold said you were brilliant. He researched your background after your husband's accident, thought you might be the right person to continue his work." Maya's protective instincts flared. "Harold researched me? How? Why?" Harold was careful. He knew his discoveries would make him a target eventually. Dr. Webb gestured toward the ocean. "Certain government agencies have a vested interest in controlling information about marine resources, especially discoveries that might challenge existing commercial fishing agreements or protected area designations. Agent Torres seemed legitimate. FBI credentials, proper procedures. Torres is legitimate. That's what makes her dangerous." Dr. Webb opened a weathered field notebook. Harold documented 17 species presumed extinct, Maya. Not just the monk seals and sea cows you found. We're talking about a hidden ecosystem that's been surviving in remote Pacific waters, possibly for centuries. The economic implications alone. Maya thought about Harold's meticulous observations, the scientific precision of his documentation. "You're saying the government wants to suppress this?" "I'm saying certain parties benefit from the current narrative about irreversible extinction, about humanity's inability to undo environmental damage. Harold's discoveries suggest recovery is possible under the right conditions, that some of our greatest conservation failures weren't failures at all. They were creatures smart enough to hide from us." The baby kicked hard enough to make Maya gasp. Dr. Webb's expression softened. "When are you due?" 6 weeks. Maya rubbed her belly, feeling overwhelmed by the convergence of personal crisis and scientific discovery. "I can't afford to get involved in some government conspiracy." I need stability, income, safety for my daughter. Harold felt the same way initially, but then he realized these creatures don't have anyone else. No advocates, no protection, no voice in decisions about their survival. Dr. Webb pointed toward Harold's coordinate notations. He documented breeding populations, Maya, successful adaptation to climate change, natural recovery that proves extinction doesn't have to be forever. Maya stared at the coordinates that represented weeks of fieldwork she couldn't afford, risks she couldn't take, discoveries that could change everything or destroy what little she had left. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help me complete Harold's documentation before Torres confiscates everything. 2 days of field observation to gather enough evidence for publication. After that, the scientific community can debate the implications while the creatures remain protected by public awareness. 2 days I don't have money for. 2 days lying to federal agents. 2 days that could put my unborn daughter at risk. Dr. Webb closed his notebook, his expression resigned but understanding. Harold said you'd see the bigger picture eventually, but I understand if the timing is wrong. As he turned to leave, Maya felt something shift inside her. Not the baby, but a deeper recognition of who she'd been before survival became her only priority. She thought about David's passion for discovery, about the marine biologist she'd trained to become, about the daughter who would inherit whatever world Maya's choices created. "Dr. Webb," she called, "what guarantee do I have that this isn't just elaborate delusion, that Harold wasn't seeing what he wanted to see?" He smiled grimly. "None. But sometimes believing in the impossible is the only way to make it possible." Maya looked out at the vast Pacific, wondering what secrets moved beneath its grey surface. 2 days, she said. Then I want my normal life back. Dr. Webb's smile held no triumph, only grim determination. "We start at dawn. Meet me at Nehalem Bay. There's a boat launch Harold used for offshore observations. Can you handle rough water?" Maya thought about the early months of her pregnancy, when morning sickness had made even calm ferry rides unbearable. Now, at 8 months, her center of gravity had shifted so dramatically that walking across uneven ground required conscious effort. Define rough. Harold's coordinates are 12 miles offshore. November swells, 40-degree water. Dr. Webb studied her face. "If something goes wrong out there, we're beyond Coast Guard response time." The baby kicked as if registering protest about maritime adventures. Maya pressed her hand to the movement, feeling the solid reality of her daughter's presence against the surreal conversation about extinct creatures and government cover-ups. 2 days ago, her biggest worry had been whether the storage unit contents would cover next month's rent. Now she was contemplating illegal research expeditions while federal agents tracked her movements. "What aren't you telling me about Harold's death?" The question emerged before Maya fully formed the thought. Heart attack seems convenient timing. Dr. Webb's expression darkened. Harold was 73, diabetic, and lived on gas station coffee and determination. His heart attack wasn't suspicious, it was inevitable. But the timing of Torres's interest in his research? That raises questions. Maya pulled Harold's journal from her backpack, flipping to the final entries. Harold's handwriting became increasingly erratic in the last weeks, notes scrawled in margins about pattern changes and increased surveillance. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, contained only GPS coordinates and a single word: confirmation. He found something definitive, Maya realized, something worth dying to document, or something worth killing to suppress. Dr. Webb's words hung between them like fog rolling off the Pacific. Harold became careless toward the end, too excited about his discoveries to maintain proper operational security. He started reaching out to marine biology departments, trying to build academic support before going public. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with coastal wind, and someone noticed. Academic circles are smaller than people realize. Harold's inquiries about presumed extinct species would have triggered alert protocols in multiple government databases. Dr. Webb gestured toward her phone. "How long before Agent Torres escalates her investigation?" before your cooperation becomes mandatory rather than requested. The weight of surveillance settled on Maya's shoulders like a physical burden. Every phone call, every credit card transaction, every movement potentially monitored and analyzed. Her privacy had evaporated the moment she'd opened Harold's storage unit, though she hadn't realized the cost until now. 2 days, she repeated, testing the commitment against her fear. Then I contact Torres and tell her everything. 2 days might be enough. Dr. Webb pulled out a marine chart marked with Harold's observation points. His documentation follows migration patterns, seasonal feeding areas. If we can photograph even one confirmed extinct species in its natural habitat, establish GPS coordinates for breeding grounds, the scientific community will have to take notice. Maya studied the chart, her marine biology training automatically analyzing depths, current patterns, optimal observation conditions. Harold's methodology was sound, his coordinate selection strategically brilliant. Whatever he'd found it through rigorous scientific investigation, not wishful thinking. But rigorous science required proper equipment, safety protocols, institutional support. Maya was about to attempt fieldwork with borrowed gear, inadequate funding, and a federal investigation breathing down her neck. The responsible choice was obvious: surrender Harold's materials to proper authorities and return to her life of storage unit auctions and financial anxiety. The baby shifted position, a gentle reminder of responsibilities beyond scientific discovery. Maya imagined explaining this moment to her daughter someday, how she'd held evidence of impossible survival in her hands and walked away because the risks seemed too great. Would her daughter understand that choice? Would Maya? "Harold's boat," she said finally. "Is it still available?" Dr. Webb nodded. "Berthed at Garibaldi Marina. Harold left instructions about equipment access, though we'll need to move quickly. Torres will check marina records eventually." Maya calculated expenses she couldn't afford for an expedition that might prove nothing. Gas, food, equipment rental, marina fees. Her credit cards were maxed, her checking account holding exactly enough to cover next week's groceries. But Harold's documentation suggested breeding populations 12 miles offshore, creatures that had survived against impossible odds while the scientific world mourned their extinction. "If we find them," Maya asked, "what happens to their hiding places? How do we protect them from the attention that killed Harold?" "We don't," Dr. Webb admitted. "We trust that public awareness provides better protection than secrecy, that scientific scrutiny offers more safety than government classification." The fog was lifting, revealing glimpses of the vast Pacific that stretched toward horizons Harold had died trying to document. Maya felt something crystallizing inside her, not certainty, but commitment to uncertainty, to the possibility that impossible discoveries sometimes required impossible risks. "Dawn," she agreed, closing Harold's journal. "But if this goes wrong, my daughter grows up without parents. Remember that when you're making decisions out there." Dr. Webb's expression softened with understanding that carried its own weight of loss. The Garibaldi Marina at dawn looked like a graveyard of ambitions. Fog-shrouded masts jutted from the grey water like crosses marking dreams that had run aground on financial realities. Maya's hands shook as she carried Harold's research materials down the weathered dock, each step bringing her closer to a point of no return she couldn't quite comprehend. Dr. Webb waited beside a 30-foot fishing vessel that had seen better decades. The Leviathan's dream bore Harold's optimistic naming sense and his practical maintenance philosophy, functional but far from reassuring. Rust streaked the hull like old blood, and the engine's idle carried an irregular rhythm that made Maya's marine safety training scream warnings. "This is what we're trusting our lives to?" Maya gripped the dock railing as another wave of morning sickness hit. 8 months pregnant and about to venture 12 miles into the Pacific on a boat that looked ready for salvage. Harold kept her in better shape than appearances suggest. Dr. Webb's confidence felt forced. He was paranoid about mechanical failure after losing 2 weeks of research to engine problems last spring. Maya studied the vessel's safety equipment, Ancient life jackets, a radio that belonged in a maritime museum, flares that might have been purchased during the Clinton administration. The responsible part of her brain catalogued a dozen reasons to walk away, but Harold's journal pressed against her ribs through her backpack, filled with observations that could rewrite everything science thought it knew about extinction and recovery. Her phone buzzed. Agent Torres. Maya let it go to voicemail, knowing the federal investigation was accelerating while she prepared to venture beyond Coast Guard response range. Dr. Webb, what if we're wrong about Harold's mental state? What if grief and isolation led him to see things that weren't there? The question emerged as Maya forced herself onto the unstable deck. What if we're risking everything for the delusions of a lonely old man? Dr. Webb secured the mooring lines with hands that moved too quickly, betraying his own anxiety. Then we'll have learned something important about the difference between hope and evidence. But Maya, I've known Harold for 30 years. I've never seen him more methodical, more careful about documentation. The engine coughed to life, settling into a steady rumble that drowned out Maya's ability to think clearly. As they pulled away from the marina, the Oregon coast began shrinking behind them, reducing her world to a few square feet of dubious safety surrounded by thousands of miles of indifferent ocean. 40 minutes out, Maya's phone lost signal, the digital tether connecting her to normal life, to storage unit auctions and medical appointments, and the mundane responsibilities that had defined her existence since David's death simply vanished. She felt unmoored in more than the literal sense, cut adrift from the identity she'd constructed around survival and financial necessity. Dr. Webb consulted Harold's charts, adjusting their heading toward coordinates that represented months of obsessive research. Harold's last observations were concentrated in a specific area, deep water near underwater formations that create unique acoustic conditions. Maya watched him navigate with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before. You've been out here with Harold. Twice. The first time, we saw nothing unusual. Normal marine life, typical feeding patterns. Harold was disappointed, but not discouraged. Dr. Webb's expression grew distant. The second time, 3 weeks before his death, we documented something that shouldn't have existed. The boat crested a larger swell, and Maya gripped the cabin wall as her center of gravity shifted dangerously. The baby responded to the motion with sharp kicks that felt like protests against her mother's judgment. What did you see? Caribbean monk seal. Unmistakable dorsal fin pattern, distinctive diving behavior. Photographed from 200 yards for 47 minutes before it disappeared. Dr. Webb pulled out a waterproof camera bag. Harold's documentation is all here. GPS coordinates, water temperature readings, behavioral observations. Maya's scientific training warred with the impossibility of the claim. Caribbean monk seals had been declared extinct in 2008 after decades of failed recovery efforts. The last confirmed sighting was 1952. Yet Harold's photographs showed crisp detail of an animal that should have been a museum exhibit. If breeding populations survived undetected for 70 years, what does that say about our understanding of marine ecosystems, about our ability to accurately assess species recovery? Maya felt her old passion for marine biology awakening despite her circumstances. The implications would be staggering, which is why certain parties want Harold's research buried permanently. Dr. Webb checked their position against his GPS unit. We're approaching his primary observation coordinates. If anything unusual lives in these waters, we'll find it in the next 6 hours. Maya looked out at the endless Pacific, feeling simultaneously smaller than she'd ever felt and more connected to something larger than her immediate survival. The baby shifted position, settling into stillness as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Whatever happened next would change everything. The only question was whether Maya would survive to see what that change looked like. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble that Maya initially mistook for another boat's engine. Dr. Webb's face went rigid as he scanned the horizon through Harold's binoculars, tracking the approaching sound until it resolved into something that made Maya's blood freeze. A Coast Guard cutter, moving fast and direct toward their position. "They found us." Dr. Webb's voice carried the flat acceptance of inevitable defeat. Torres must have flagged Harold's boat registration, monitored marina security footage. Maya watched the government vessel close the distance with mechanical precision, its white hull cutting through the grey swells like a blade through her last hope of controlling this situation. Her phone, useless for calls but still tracking GPS location, had betrayed them to authorities who'd been watching more carefully than she'd realized. "We could dump the materials," she said desperately, clutching Harold's research bag. "Tell them we were just taking a leisure cruise." 8 months pregnant on a fishing boat in 40-degree weather? Dr. Webb was already throttling down the engine. "They know exactly why we're here." The Leviathan's dream bobbed helplessly as the Coast Guard cutter pulled alongside, its engines overwhelming Harold's ancient motor. Maya could see Agent Torres on the deck, flanked by uniformed officers whose expressions suggested this wouldn't be a friendly conversation. The federal investigation she'd tried to outrun had found her in the middle of the Pacific with nowhere to hide. "Maya Chen," Torres called across the water through a bullhorn, "shut down your engine and prepare for boarding." Maya's hands trembled as she watched the agents prepare their approach. Everything she'd worked for since David's death, her fragile financial stability, her carefully constructed survival plan, her hope of providing security for her daughter, was about to be destroyed by her decision to chase impossible discoveries with a dead hunter's research. "Dr. Webb," Torres continued, "you're under arrest for theft of federal evidence and obstruction of a terrorism investigation." Terrorism investigation. The words hit Maya like cold seawater, transforming Harold's passionate documentation into something that could destroy her life completely. Not just financial ruin now, but potential criminal charges, federal prosecution, her daughter born while her mother sat in federal custody awaiting trial. Dr. Webb raised his hands as armed officers transferred to Harold's boat. "Maya had nothing to do with this. She's an innocent civilian who bought a storage unit at auction." But Maya could see in Torres's expression that innocence was no longer an option. Her presence on this boat, 12 miles offshore with Harold's research materials, made her a co-conspirator in whatever federal crime they'd decided this had become. The distinction between victim and perpetrator had evaporated the moment she'd chosen to trust Dr. Webb's promises about scientific discovery. Harold Grimm's research contains classified information related to naval operations and marine resource security, Torres announced, as officers secured Harold's materials. His documentation of protected coordinates constitutes a threat to national security. Maya watched Harold's journals disappear into evidence bags, 30 years of careful observation reduced to potential criminal evidence. The photographs that could have proven impossible survival, the GPS coordinates that marked hidden ecosystems, the scientific revolution that had cost Harold his life, all of it vanishing into government classification where it would never see daylight. "My daughter," Maya whispered, one hand pressed to her belly as contractions of stress and fear began rippling through her abdomen. "I'm 8 months pregnant. I can't—" "Medical attention will be provided during processing," Torres said without warmth. "But interference with a federal investigation carries mandatory minimums regardless of personal circumstances." The baby's movements had stopped. Maya realized with growing panic that the stress of arrest, the cold Pacific wind, the fear coursing through her system had triggered something wrong. The sudden absence of kicks and shifts felt like a vacuum opening inside her, as if her daughter was retreating from a world that had become too dangerous to enter. As the Coast Guard cutter began towing Harold's boat back toward shore, Maya watched the coordinates of their destination disappear behind them. Whatever secrets lived in these waters would remain hidden, protected by government classification rather than scientific understanding. Harold's death had accomplished nothing except destroying the lives of everyone who'd tried to continue his work. Dr. Webb caught her eye across the crowded deck, his expression carrying apologies that couldn't undo the choice Maya had made to trust him. She'd gambled her daughter's future on the possibility of impossible discoveries and lost everything: her freedom, her financial stability, her carefully constructed plans for survival. The Oregon coast grew larger ahead of them, promising custody hearings and legal proceedings, and a daughter born into uncertainty because her mother had believed that hope sometimes required believing in the impossible. Maya closed her eyes against the spray and wind, feeling Harold's dream of hidden ecosystems sinking beneath the weight of federal authority. All that remained was the long journey back to shore and the consequences waiting there. Some mysteries, she understood now, were meant to stay buried. The first hour of the return journey passed in silence, broken only by engine noise and the slap of waves against the cutter's hull. Maya sat on a bench in the cabin, handcuffed but allowed to keep her jacket against the cold, watching Agent Torres sort through Harold's research with methodical efficiency. Each photograph, each journal entry, each GPS coordinate disappeared into labeled evidence bags like pieces of a puzzle Torres was determined to solve. Maya's abdomen cramped sporadically, stress contractions that made her hyper-aware of every sensation in her body. The baby remained still, and that stillness felt like a judgment on the choices that had brought them here. 8 months of careful planning, cautious decisions, and responsible preparation undone by 3 days of believing in impossible things. "The coordinates Harold documented," Torres said suddenly, looking up from a journal. "How much do you know about their significance?" Maya met her eyes with defiance she didn't feel. "I know they represent 30 years of a man's passion for marine life. I know he died believing he'd found something extraordinary. He found classified naval research stations." Torres's voice carried the weight of information Maya hadn't possessed. Harold's extinct species were experimental subjects in a black-budget marine biology program. Genetic reconstruction, de-extinction research, military applications of marine mammal intelligence. The revelation hit Maya like physical impact. Harold hadn't discovered naturally surviving populations. He'd stumbled across government experiments designed to bring extinct species back from genetic templates. The Caribbean monk seals, the Steller's sea cow specimens, the impossible photographs were all evidence of classified research that had been operating in Pacific waters for decades. "He thought he was documenting natural survival," Maya whispered, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. He had no idea he was photographing military experiments. Dr. Webb looked stricken across the cabin. The behavioral patterns, the seasonal appearances, it wasn't natural migration. It was scheduled research protocols. Torres nodded grimly. Harold's documentation threatened to expose a program that's existed since the 1970s. When he started asking questions at marine biology conferences, when he began sharing coordinates with researchers, he became a security risk. Maya felt the last pieces of Harold's story clicking into place with terrible logic. His death hadn't been an accident or natural causes. It had been elimination of a threat to national security. Harold's passion for impossible discoveries had led him to document things that were never meant to be seen by civilian eyes. "You killed him," she said, the words emerging before she could stop them. "He was an old man with a camera, and you killed him to protect experiments he didn't even understand." "Harold Grimm died of a heart attack in his home," Torres replied without emotion. "The timing was unfortunate, but not suspicious." But Maya could see the truth in Torres's careful phrasing, in the way her eyes avoided direct contact. Harold's heart attack had been induced, his death disguised as natural causes to close a security breach before it became a public revelation. The storage unit auction, Maya's discovery of his materials, her investigation into his research, all of it had been unplanned complications in a cover-up that should have ended with Harold's funeral. "And now we know too much," Maya said, one hand pressed protectively over her belly. "What happens to people who accidentally discover classified DE to extinction programs?" Torres was quiet for a long moment, consulting something on her phone that Maya couldn't see. When she looked up, her expression had shifted to something that might have been regret. That depends on their willingness to maintain appropriate discretion. Maya understood the offer being extended, silence in exchange for freedom, agreement to forget everything she'd learned about Harold's research, about government experiments, about impossible species swimming in classified waters. Her daughter's future balanced against her willingness to pretend the last 3 days had never happened. But the baby chose that moment to move, a gentle shift that felt like awakening rather than retreat. Maya felt her daughter responding to her elevated heart rate, to the adrenaline and fear and terrible understanding coursing through her system. Not retreating from a dangerous world, but preparing to enter it with whatever strength her mother could provide. Harold documented those creatures because he believed they deserved to exist, Maya said finally. He spent 30 years proving that extinction didn't have to be permanent, that species could survive against impossible odds. It doesn't matter whether they survived naturally or through genetic reconstruction. What matters is that they're alive. Torres leaned forward slightly. What are you saying, Miss Chen? Maya met her eyes directly, feeling something crystallize inside her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the daughter who would inherit whatever world these choices created. I'm saying Harold was right. Some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything. The Oregon coast was visible now, promising consequences Maya couldn't predict but refused to run from. Harold's revolution hadn't died with him. It had been waiting for someone willing to believe that. Hope sometimes required impossible courage. The real revelation wasn't about extinct species or government experiments. It was about choosing what kind of mother, what kind of person Maya would be when her daughter finally entered this complicated, dangerous, miraculous world. The silence that followed Maya's declaration stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Agent Torres studied her with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a situation that had shifted beyond initial parameters. Outside the cabin windows, the Oregon coastline grew steadily larger, but Maya felt as though she was moving towards something, rather than being dragged back to captivity. You understand what you're suggesting, Torres said finally. Cooperation with a classified program that officially doesn't exist. Maya's hand remained pressed against her belly, feeling her daughter's gentle movements as confirmation rather than protest. I'm suggesting that Harold's 30 years of documentation represents the most comprehensive study of these species in existence. Whether they're naturally surviving or scientifically reconstructed, they need advocates who understand their behavioral patterns. Dr. Webb's eyes widened as he grasped the direction of Maya's reasoning. Maya, you can't seriously be considering... I'm considering that my daughter deserves to inherit a world where impossible things are still possible, Maya interrupted, her voice carrying new strength. Harold died protecting these creatures. I won't let that sacrifice be meaningless. Torres pulled out her phone, typing rapidly in what Maya recognized as coded communication with superiors. The federal agent's demeanor had shifted from interrogator to negotiator, suggesting that Maya's proposition carried unexpected weight. Whatever classified program had been operating in Pacific waters needed exactly what Maya was offering: legitimate scientific expertise with personal investment in maintaining secrecy. Your background in marine biology, Torres said after several minutes. Dr. Webb mentioned your dissertation research on deep-water mammal populations. What was your specific area of focus? Maya felt pieces clicking together in her mind, connections she hadn't previously recognized. Acoustic communication patterns in cetacean species. Specifically, how environmental changes affect interspecies cooperation in feeding behaviors. She paused, understanding dawning. You need someone who can interpret Harold's behavioral documentation. Harold documented interaction patterns we don't fully understand, Torres admitted. The reconstructed species display behaviors that don't match historical records. They're adapting, evolving, creating new social structures that our researchers can't predict. Dr. Webb leaned forward, his earlier despair replaced by scientific curiosity. What kind of adaptations? Torres hesitated, clearly calculating how much information to reveal. Cross-species cooperation that shouldn't be possible. Caribbean monk seals coordinating hunting strategies with Stella's sea cow populations. Acoustic communication patterns that suggest complex social hierarchies spanning multiple reconstructed species. Maya's pulse quickened as she grasped the implications. They're not just surviving, they're creating new ecosystems. The isolation that was meant to protect the classified program has allowed them to develop unprecedented behavioral relationships. Which is why Harold's documentation became critical, Torres continued. He observed these interactions from a natural history perspective, without the constraints of laboratory protocols. His research represents behavioral baseline data we can't replicate under controlled conditions. The baby shifted position, settling against Maya's ribs in a way that felt like support rather than burden. Maya realized that her daughter's future might not be the liability she'd feared, but rather the motivation that made her uniquely qualified for what Torres was proposing. "What exactly are you offering?" Maya asked. Torres consulted her phone again, apparently receiving authorization for disclosures she hadn't been cleared to make an hour earlier. Consultant position with the Marine Species Recovery Initiative. Full security clearance, substantial compensation, housing near the research facility. Your daughter would grow up in a community dedicated to protecting impossibilities. Maya looked at Dr. Webb, seeing her own amazement reflected in his expression. Harold's passion project had somehow transformed into a government career opportunity that could solve every financial problem she'd faced since David's death. "And Harold's research?" Dr. Webb asked. "Becomes the foundation for expanded documentation protocols," Torres replied. His 30 years of observation data integrated with current behavioral studies. His death won't be meaningless if his work continues under proper security parameters. Maya felt something settling inside her that had nothing to do with resignation and everything to do with recognition. This was what Harold had been working toward without knowing it, not exposure of hidden species, but protection of creatures that needed human advocates to survive in an impossible situation. "My daughter," Maya said carefully, "would grow up knowing that extinction isn't permanent, that species can survive against impossible odds through human intervention and scientific dedication. She'd grow up in a world where hope isn't naive," Torres agreed, "where believing in impossible things leads to protecting them." The Oregon coast was close enough now to distinguish individual buildings, but Maya no longer felt like she was returning to the life she'd left behind. Harold's revolution hadn't died with him. It had evolved into something more complex and more hopeful than simple exposure. Maya met Torres's gaze directly, feeling her daughter respond to her elevated heart rate with movements that felt like agreement. "When do we start?" The real revelation wasn't about extinct species or government experiments. It was about choosing to become the kind of mother who showed her daughter that sometimes the impossible was simply waiting for someone brave enough to protect it. Torres smiled for the first time since boarding Harold's boat, an expression that transformed her from federal enforcer to scientific collaborator. "We start with getting you and your daughter safely to shore. Then we begin the real work." Maya felt the weight of her decision settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The handcuffs came off as Torres made another coded phone call, this one clearly communicating a change in Maya's status from suspect to asset. Dr. Webb's relief was palpable as he moved closer, no longer separated by the invisible barrier of federal custody. "The facility is located on a protected inlet north of Astoria," Torres explained as she secured Harold's research materials in containers marked with official seals rather than evidence tags. 57 personnel, including marine biologists, genetic researchers, and behavioral specialists. Most have been there for years. It becomes more than a job when you're protecting species the world believes are extinct. Maya watched the familiar coastline approach with new eyes, understanding that she was seeing the boundary between her old life and something unprecedented. The storage unit business, the financial desperation, the careful plans for single motherhood, all of it was being replaced by possibilities she couldn't have imagined 3 days ago. Harold's journals contain references to seasonal patterns we've never observed. Torres continued, consulting her tablet as the cutter adjusted course toward coordinates Maya didn't recognize. He documented behavioral changes that our contained observation couldn't capture. Your expertise in acoustic communication could help us understand what he was seeing. The baby kicked vigorously, and Maya found herself interpreting the movement as enthusiasm rather than distress. Her daughter would enter a world where impossible things were not only real but protected, where scientific discovery served conservation rather than exploitation. It was the kind of legacy David would have wanted, his death in a laboratory accident somehow leading to their daughter's involvement in the most extraordinary marine research on the planet. There are risks, Torres said, her tone shifting to something more personal. The classification level means complete separation from your previous life. Friends, family, financial records, everything gets reconstructed under new parameters. Maya Chen, the storage unit flipper, disappears completely. Maya considered the life she was leaving behind. Medical debt, loneliness, uncertainty about providing for her daughter. The choice felt less like sacrifice than liberation. Maya Chen, the marine biologist, was always who I really was. The rest was just survival. Dr. Webb squeezed her shoulder gently. Harold would have been amazed. His research leading to protection rather than exposure, it's exactly what he would have wanted if he'd understood the full situation. As they approached a dock Maya had never seen despite living near Astoria for years, she noticed the subtle security measures that had kept it invisible to civilian traffic. Guard stations disguised as maintenance buildings, barriers that looked like natural rock formations, personnel in civilian clothing who moved with military precision. Harold's 30 years of observation had been conducted at the edges of a secret that was vast, sophisticated, and dedicated to precisely the kind of conservation he'd believed in. Torres helped Maya from the boat to the dock with unexpected gentleness, clearly aware that an 8 months pregnant woman required different handling than typical federal detainees. Dr. Sarah Reeves will be your primary contact. She's been running behavioral studies since the program began. She knew Harold's work before we realized he was documenting our research. Maya's legs felt unsteady on solid ground after the hours at sea, but her mind was racing with anticipation rather than fear. The facility beyond the dock looked like a standard marine research station, but she could sense the extraordinary work happening behind its conventional facade. This was where impossible things were nurtured back to existence, where hope took the form of rigorous scientific dedication. The housing complex is designed for families, Torres mentioned as they walked toward the main building. Your daughter will have playmates whose parents understand that some secrets are worth keeping. She'll grow up thinking this kind of work is normal. Maya paused at the entrance, one hand on her belly and the other touching the door handle that would admit her to Harold's true legacy. Inside waited researchers who had dedicated their careers to proving that extinction wasn't permanent, that species could return from genetic memory through human intervention and patience. Harold spent 30 years documenting miracles without knowing it, she said finally. Now we get to protect them. Torres nodded, entering access codes that opened doors to Maya's future. Welcome to the Marine Species Recovery Initiative, Dr. Chen. Your real work begins now. As Maya stepped across the threshold, her daughter moved vigorously, as if responding to proximity to the extraordinary creatures whose protection would define both their lives. Harold's revolution hadn't ended with his death. It had been waiting for someone willing to embrace the impossible and make it her life's work. The road back had led not to her old life, but to the future she'd never dared to imagine. Maya's first glimpse inside the Marine Species Recovery Initiative revealed a world that defied everything she thought she understood about government facilities. Instead of sterile corridors and bureaucratic efficiency, she found herself in a space that hummed with passionate scientific energy. Researchers moved between workstations displaying behavioral footage that made her breath catch. Massive forms gliding through kelp forests that shouldn't exist. Acoustic patterns scrolling across monitors in frequencies that belonged to voices from beyond extinction. Dr. Chen. A woman approached with calloused hands and eyes bright with the particular intensity Maya recognized in fellow marine biologists. "I'm Sarah Reeves. I've been following Harold's documentation for months without knowing who was creating it." Maya accepted the handshake, feeling her daughter respond to her elevated heart rate with movements that seemed almost anticipatory. "You knew his work?" "Behavioral patterns we couldn't explain were showing up in our contained populations," Dr. Reeves explained, leading Maya deeper into the facility. "Feeding strategies, communication protocols, social hierarchies that didn't match any historical data. Then Torres showed us Harold's journals, and everything made sense. They passed observation windows that revealed pools containing creatures Maya's rational mind insisted were impossible. A Caribbean monk seal surfaced near the glass, its movements graceful and curious, studying the humans with intelligence that seemed to recognize their protective intent. Behind it, forms too large for the viewing angle suggested the presence of species that existed nowhere else on Earth. "The real challenge isn't genetic reconstruction," Dr. Reeves continued, noticing Maya's amazement. "It's understanding how these species adapt when they're removed from evolutionary pressures that led to their extinction. They're not just surviving, they're becoming something new." Maya paused at a workstation displaying acoustic analysis that immediately captured her attention. Frequency patterns scrolled across multiple monitors, showing communication exchanges between species that had never coexisted in nature. Her dissertation research suddenly felt like preparation for exactly this moment. "Cross-species coordination," she murmured, studying waveforms that indicated complex information exchange. "They're developing shared communication protocols." Harold documented the early stages without understanding what he was observing, Dr. Reeves said. "Wild populations developing cooperative behaviors that our contained subjects then began exhibiting, as if they were learning from interactions we couldn't monitor." The implications hit Maya like a physical force. Harold's 30 years hadn't just been documenting surviving populations. He'd been witnessing the birth of unprecedented ecosystems. Species brought back from genetic memory were creating relationships that had never existed in natural history, adapting to circumstances no evolutionary model could predict. "The government classification," Maya said, her understanding crystallizing. "It's not just about hiding de-extinction technology, it's about protecting species that are evolving beyond their original parameters." Torres appeared beside them, apparently monitoring Maya's integration into the facility. "The public isn't ready for proof that extinction can be reversed through genetic reconstruction, but they're even less ready for evidence that reconstructed species might surpass their original evolutionary potential." Maya's daughter kicked forcefully, and she found herself interpreting the movement as recognition rather than distress. Her child would inherit a world where impossible things were not only real but actively protected by human dedication. The storage unit auction that had seemed like financial desperation 3 days ago had actually been the beginning of the most extraordinary opportunity in marine biology. "Harold's behavioral documentation," Dr. Reeves said, pulling up files on her workstation. 3 decades of interaction patterns, feeding behaviors, acoustic communication, seasonal migrations. Data. We need to understand what these species are becoming. Maya studied Harold's meticulous records with growing appreciation for his unconscious contribution to scientific history. His passion for documenting impossible creatures had created the baseline research necessary for understanding evolutionary adaptation under conditions that had never existed before. "My expertise in acoustic communication," Maya said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "You need someone who can interpret how they're developing new social structures." Harold observed the behaviors, Dr. Reeves agreed, but he couldn't analyze the biological mechanisms driving unprecedented cooperation between species that were separated by millions of years of evolution. The challenge crystallized before Maya with perfect clarity. Everything she'd learned about marine mammal communication, every research technique she'd developed, every analytical framework from her academic career, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Harold's revolution required someone who could bridge the gap between his naturalist observations and rigorous scientific interpretation. Maya felt her daughter settle against her ribs in a position that seemed almost expectant. The baby would grow up in a world where extinction wasn't permanent, where human intervention could resurrect lost species and guide them toward evolutionary possibilities beyond anything nature had originally created. "When do I see Harold's complete documentation?" Maya asked, feeling the last traces of her old life dissolving into determination. Dr. Reeves smiled, leading her toward a secure research area that would become her new professional home. "Right now, Dr. Chen, your real work begins immediately." The final test wasn't about choosing between old life and new. It was about proving worthy of impossible miracles that needed human protection to survive. Maya followed Dr. Reeves toward the secure research area, her heart racing with anticipation that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. But as they approached the reinforced doors, alarms began screaming throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in pulsing red as researchers abandoned their workstations, moving with practiced efficiency toward emergency protocols. "Containment breach in Section C," came the announcement over intercom systems. "All personnel to safe stations. This is not a drill." Dr. Reeves grabbed Maya's arm, her face transformed by panic. "The adult Stella's sea cow. Something's wrong with the holding pool systems." Maya felt her daughter responding to her spiking adrenaline with violent kicks that doubled her over. Through observation windows, she could see massive forms thrashing in pools that suddenly seemed inadequate for creatures that belonged in open ocean. The Caribbean monk seals were calling in distress frequencies that cut through the facility's chaos like acoustic knives. "Dr. Chen, you need to get to the evacuation area." Torres appeared, her federal authority reasserting itself in crisis mode. Pregnant civilians aren't authorized for emergency response. But Maya was staring at the acoustic displays that still scrolled across abandoned workstations. The frequency patterns weren't random panic. They were coordinated distress calls unlike anything in the scientific literature. These creatures were communicating their terror in voices that had been extinct for decades, and no one in the facility understood what they were saying. "They're not just panicking," Maya said, studying waveforms that indicated complex linguistic structure. "They're trying to tell us something." Another alarm joined the cacophony as containment systems in additional sections began failing. Through the chaos, Maya realized this wasn't mechanical failure. It was coordinated response to something the creatures sensed that human monitoring couldn't detect. Dr. Reeves was shouting into emergency communication systems, trying to coordinate response teams, while Maya watched the acoustic patterns evolve into something that made her blood freeze. The creatures weren't just distressed. They were warning each other about immediate danger that the facility's security systems hadn't recognized. "The boats," Maya said suddenly. "Harold's coordinates. Someone else is using them." Torres spun toward her, federal training overriding evacuation protocols. "What boats?" Maya grabbed the nearest workstation, her fingers flying across acoustic analysis software she'd learned during her dissertation research. The distress calls were structured like alarm sequences, but underneath them ran communication patterns that indicated external threat recognition. These creatures were responding to something approaching from the protected inlet. "Harold documented wild populations," Maya explained, her voice cutting through the chaos. "If someone else found his research, if they're coming for the creatures." The facility shook as something impacted the outer containment barriers. Through observation windows, Maya could see the reconstructed species responding with behaviors that had never been documented. cooperative defense strategies that suggested these creatures had learned to protect themselves and each other against threats their original evolution had never encountered. Torres was already coordinating security response through communications equipment Maya hadn't noticed before. Armed approach from the Eastern Channel, multiple vessels, military configuration. They're not ours. Dr. Reeves reached Maya just as another wave of contractions doubled her over. Dr. Chen, you can't be here. I'm the only one who understands what they're saying. Maya gasped, forcing herself upright despite the pain radiating through her abdomen. The creature's distress calls were becoming more sophisticated, incorporating frequencies that suggested they were coordinating defense strategies in real time. The observation windows suddenly revealed the source of the creature's terror. Armed personnel in diving equipment were cutting through outer containment barriers, moving toward the holding pools with equipment that looked designed for extraction rather than research. Someone had found Harold's documentation and traced it back to its source. Maya's daughter kicked frantically as another contraction hit, but Maya forced herself to focus on the acoustic displays. The creatures were calling to each other in patterns that indicated recognition. They knew these weren't facility personnel. Somehow, these reconstructed species retained genetic memories that included fear of human predation. They remember, Maya whispered, understanding crystallizing through her pain. The genetic reconstruction included survival instincts. They know the difference between protectors and hunters. Torres was shouting coordinates into communication systems while Dr. Reeves tried to guide Maya toward safer areas of the facility. But Maya couldn't leave, not when she was the only person present who could interpret what these impossible creatures were trying to communicate as armed strangers invaded their sanctuary. The final confrontation wasn't between Maya and government agents or between scientific discovery and bureaucratic secrecy. It was between the protective dedication of researchers who had devoted their lives to bringing species back from extinction and whoever had found Harold's research and seen opportunity rather than miracle. As the facility's defenses engaged, and Maya felt her daughter preparing for premature arrival, she realized that Harold's revolution had attracted exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 30 years trying to avoid. The creature's warnings filled the facility with voices that had been silent for decades, calling for protection that only humans could provide. Maya's deepest fear wasn't labor complications or federal custody. It was failing creatures who trusted humans to guard impossible miracles against those who would exploit them. Maya's hands flew across the acoustic analysis equipment as another contraction nearly brought her to her knees. The creature's distress calls were escalating into something she'd never heard before, coordinated alarm sequences that suggested they were organizing collective defense against the armed intruders cutting through their sanctuary's barriers. Dr. Chen, you have to evacuate now, Dr. Reeves insisted, but Maya shook her head, sweat beading on her forehead as she translated the impossible voices filling the facility. They're not just calling for help, Maya gasped, her fingers trembling as she adjusted frequency filters. They're trying to protect each other. The adult Stella's sea cow, she's positioning herself between the smaller monk seals and the breach points. Through the chaos of alarms and emergency lighting, Maya could see the truth Harold had died protecting. These weren't just reconstructed specimens, they were a family. 30 years of genetic reconstruction had created bonds between species that had never coexisted in nature, and now they faced extinction again because of human greed. Torres appeared beside her, weapon drawn and face grim. The extraction team isn't government. Someone intercepted Harold's research and wants the specimens for private acquisition. Maya's daughter kicked violently as another wave of pain crashed through her, but she forced herself to remain upright. The acoustic displays showed communication patterns that made her heart break. The creatures were saying goodbye to each other, preparing for separation or death, with voices that carried the grief of species that had already experienced extinction once. "I can't let this happen," Maya whispered, her decision crystallizing through the pain. Everything she'd discovered, Everything Harold had protected, everything these researchers had dedicated their lives to preserving, it all balanced on this moment. Dr. Reeves grabbed her arm. "Maya, your baby—" "My daughter deserves a world where these creatures exist," Maya said, struggling to her feet as the facility shook from another breach. She looked at the acoustic equipment, at Harold's research files, at 30 years of documentation that represented humanity's greatest conservation achievement. But she also deserves to know her mother fought for what mattered. Maya's hands moved across the communication systems with desperate precision. If the creatures could recognize protectors from predators through genetic memory, perhaps they could also recognize allies through acoustic signals. Her dissertation research had focused on cross-species communication patterns. Now she would discover if extinct species could learn to trust human voices. She began broadcasting into the facility's underwater communication array, using frequency patterns she de-identified in Harold's documentation, combined with protective vocal signatures from her own research. The response was immediate. The creature's panic calls shifted into something that sounded almost like questions, as if they were asking whether the approaching humans could be trusted. "You're trying to talk to them," Torres said, understanding dawning across her face. "Harold spent 30 years earning their trust without knowing it," Maya replied, modulating her broadcasts to match the acoustic patterns the creatures associated with safety. "Someone has to tell them we're still trying to protect them." The pain hit her like a tidal wave, forcing her to grip the console as her daughter announced her intention to arrive in the middle of the most crucial moment in conservation history. Maya felt her water break, just as the creature's responses indicated they were moving toward defensive positions that might give the facility's security teams tactical advantages. Dr. Reeves was beside her instantly. "Maya, the baby's coming now." "Not yet," Maya gasped, maintaining her acoustic communications even as her body betrayed her timing. Through the observation windows, she could see the adult Stella's sea cow responding to her signals, positioning herself to protect the smaller species while providing cover for facility personnel. Torres coordinated security response, while Maya translated between human defenders and resurrected species, her broadcasts becoming the bridge that allowed extinct creatures to actively participate in their own protection. The acoustic equipment showed coordination patterns that defied everything science understood about interspecies cooperation. Maya's final broadcast went out just as the pain became overwhelming, her voice carrying through underwater speakers to creatures that had learned to trust Harold's protection and now extended that trust to her. The response filled the facility with calls that sounded like acceptance, like determination, like species that had survived extinction once and refused to surrender again. As Maya collapsed into Dr. Reeves's arms, her daughter beginning her urgent arrival, she watched the acoustic displays show something miraculous. The creatures weren't just defending themselves. They were helping facility security coordinate response patterns, using their acoustic abilities to provide tactical information about the intruders' positions. "She's coming," Dr. Reeves said, supporting Maya as Torres continued coordinating the defense. Maya's last coherent thought before the birth consumed her completely was that her daughter would enter the world surrounded by voices that had been silent for decades, protected by creatures whose existence proved that extinction wasn't permanent, and defended by humans who understood that some miracles were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The cost of victory was everything Maya had been before this moment, but what she was becoming felt like Harold's true legacy finally fulfilled. Maya's daughter arrived into chaos transformed into wonder, her first breath synchronized with the triumphant calls of creatures that had just helped defend their own sanctuary. Dr. Reeves worked with steady hands while alarms faded to silence, the facility's emergency lights giving way to the soft glow of research stations returning to normal operation. "She's perfect," Dr. Reeves whispered, placing the tiny, dark-haired baby against Maya's chest. Through the observation windows, Maya could see the Stella's sea cow floating peacefully again, her massive form radiating the calm satisfaction of a guardian who had successfully protected her adopted family. Torres appeared beside them, her weapon holstered and her face showing the exhaustion of crisis resolved. The extraction team retreated when they realized the creatures were actively resisting. Turns out poachers aren't equipped to handle extinct species that fight back with military precision. Maya cradled her daughter with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired. The baby's eyes opened, dark and alert, taking in a world where impossible voices still echoed through underwater speakers. Her daughter would never know a reality where extinction was permanent, where human dedication couldn't resurrect lost miracles. "What happens now?" Maya asked, her voice hoarse from the acoustic communications that had bridged the gap between human protection and creature cooperation. Dr. Reeves checked Maya's vitals with gentle efficiency, her researcher's mind already processing the unprecedented data they'd just collected. The creature's defensive coordination exceeded every projection. They've developed tactical intelligence that suggests genetic reconstruction activated dormant evolutionary potential. Through the facility's communication systems, Maya could hear the gradually settling acoustic patterns as the resurrected species returned to their normal routines. The Caribbean monk seals were exchanging what sounded like reassuring calls, while the juvenile specimens clustered near their protective elder with voices that carried relief rather than fear. Torres pulled up a chair beside Maya's makeshift medical station, her federal authority softened by witnessing something that transcended bureaucratic categories. Harold's documentation is now classified at the highest levels, but not to suppress it, to protect expansion of the program. Maya's daughter made a small sound that seemed to echo the acoustic frequencies still playing through the facility's speakers. The timing felt symbolic, a new generation beginning life surrounded by voices that represented humanity's capacity for redemption rather than destruction. The extraction attempt proved these species can defend themselves, Dr. Reeves continued, updating medical charts while monitoring the creature's post-crisis behavior. But it also demonstrated they're willing to cooperate with humans they trust. The implications for conservation biology are revolutionary. Maya studied her daughter's face, seeing features that reminded her of David's scientific curiosity combined with her own stubborn determination. The baby would grow up understanding that extinction was a challenge rather than an inevitability, that human intervention could guide evolution toward possibilities beyond anything nature had originally created. Harold spent 30 years documenting behavioral patterns, Maya said slowly, pieces of understanding still clicking into place. But he never realized he was also building the foundation for interspecies military cooperation. The facility's acoustic displays showed the creatures gradually resuming normal communication patterns, but with subtle modifications that suggested they retained memory of their successful defense coordination. These resurrected species were learning from each crisis, developing capabilities that exceeded their original evolutionary parameters. Torres reviewed security footage on her tablet, her expression mixing professional assessment with personal awe. The tactical information they provided was more accurate than our electronic surveillance. They were tracking intruder positions through acoustic signatures our equipment couldn't detect. Maya's daughter settled against her chest with the contentment of a child born into safety earned through extraordinary sacrifice. The baby's arrival marked not just personal transformation, but the beginning of a new era where extinct species could actively participate in their own protection. Dr. Reeves completed Maya's medical evaluation while explaining the facility's post-crisis protocols. Recovery period will be monitored here, where your daughter can acclimate to acoustic environments that will be crucial for your ongoing research. The research position was no longer a question. Maya had proven her value by becoming the first human to establish real-time communication with genetically reconstructed species during active crisis. Her expertise in acoustic analysis had evolved into something unprecedented, the ability to coordinate between human technology and extinct creature intelligence. Maya looked through the observation windows at creatures that had trusted her voice enough to risk everything for mutual protection. Harold's legacy had transformed from solitary documentation into collaborative revolution, proving that some miracles required multiple generations of human dedication to fully realize. Her daughter would inherit Harold's passion, David's scientific rigor, and Maya's determination to protect impossible discoveries. The cost had been everything Maya thought she wanted, but what she'd gained felt like evolution itself, guided by human love toward outcomes that surpassed every original dream. The resolution wasn't an ending, but a beginning, measured in voices that had been silent for decades and would never be silenced again. The return. 3 months later, Maya stood in her renovated Astoria apartment, watching her daughter sleep in a crib positioned near windows that faced the Columbia River. The baby stirred at the familiar sound of Maya's laptop, playing acoustic recordings from the facility, frequencies that had become as essential to the child's sleep routine as lullabies. The apartment bore little resemblance to the cramped, debt-haunted space Maya had fled that November morning. Federal compensation for her consultation work had eliminated David's medical bills, but more importantly, her new position as senior acoustic specialist for the Pacific Conservation Initiative had given her life a purpose that felt worthy of everything she'd lost and found. She recognizes the monk seal calls, Maya murmured into her phone, updating Dr. Reeves during their weekly check-in. Through the laptop speakers, the Caribbean monk seal's evening communication patterns created a gentle backdrop to her daughter's peaceful breathing. Prenatal acoustic exposure to extinct species vocalizations, Dr. Reeves replied with the excitement of a researcher documenting unprecedented phenomena. We're monitoring cognitive development markers that suggest your daughter may have enhanced frequency recognition capabilities. Maya smiled, adjusting the baby's blanket while reviewing data from Harold's journals, now officially declassified for authorized research. Her coffee table displayed Harold's photographs alongside her own recent documentation. 30 years of solitary observation merged with collaborative scientific advancement. The Lonely Hunter's work had become the foundation for the world's most ambitious conservation program. The apartment door opened as Torres arrived for her regular visit, no longer wearing federal authority, but carrying groceries and wearing the casual comfort of someone who'd become genuine family. The former agent had resigned her position to accept the initiative's security coordination role, her protective instincts finding better purpose in guarding resurrected species than pursuing bureaucratic objectives. "The Stella's sea cow matriarch asked about you again," Torres said, unpacking fresh vegetables while Maya's daughter stirred at the sound of voices. "Dr. Reeves thinks she associates your vocal patterns with successful problem-solving." Maya laughed, a sound that carried joy she'd never expected to experience again. The creatures remembered her, recognized her voice across acoustic systems, and responded to her communications with trust that felt like the greatest professional achievement of her career. Harold's 30 years of patient documentation had created the foundation, but Maya had become the bridge between human science and extinct creature intelligence. "Any word from the expansion sites?" Maya asked, reviewing progress reports from 3 additional facilities now under construction along the Pacific coast. Harold's coordinate system had revealed multiple locations where genetic reconstruction could be conducted safely, transforming his secret discoveries into a network of conservation sanctuaries. Site 4 achieved first successful communication protocols yesterday, Torres replied, settling into the chair beside Maya's research station. The Vancouver team used your acoustic templates to establish trust with their monk seal pod. They're requesting direct consultation for next week's Stella's Sea Cow introduction. Maya's daughter opened her eyes at the mention of the sea cow, making soft sounds that seemed to echo the frequency patterns still playing through the laptop speakers. The baby's reactions to specific creature vocalizations had become so consistent that Maya suspected her daughter would grow up fluent in languages that had been silent for decades. The evening routine had become Maya's favorite part of each day. She would review research, data, while her daughter played with toys positioned near the acoustic equipment, the baby's responses providing unexpected insights into how human cognition processed extinct species communication patterns. Every small revelation felt like honoring David's scientific curiosity and Harold's protective dedication simultaneously. "Your mother would be proud," Maya whispered to her daughter, remembering David's excitement whenever his research yielded unexpected discoveries. The baby grabbed Maya's finger with surprising strength, her grip feeling like determination inherited across generations of people who refused to accept impossibilities as permanent. Torres prepared dinner while Maya updated her acoustic analysis, the domestic normalcy a stark contrast to the crisis that had brought them together. Yet the sense of family felt authentic. Three individuals whose lives had been transformed by creatures that proved extinction wasn't inevitable, bonded by their shared commitment to protecting miracles that exceeded every original expectation. As evening light faded over the Columbia River, Maya played the latest recordings from the facility. Her daughter settled into sleep, surrounded by voices that represented humanity's capacity for redemption, while Maya continued analyzing communication patterns that would guide tomorrow's conservation decisions. The apartment filled with the peaceful sounds of extinct species saying goodnight to their human guardians, acoustic patterns that had become Maya's evening prayer. Harold's legacy lived in every creature call, David's memory influenced every scientific decision, and Maya's future stretched toward discoveries that would ensure her daughter inherited a world where resurrection was possible. Maya closed her laptop and lifted her sleeping daughter, carrying her to the window where moonlight reflected off water that had once known these creatures in their original existence. The return wasn't to her old life, but to a new understanding of what family meant, connections that transcended species, generations, and the arbitrary boundaries between possible and impossible. Her daughter would grow up knowing that love could guide evolution itself toward miracles that surpassed every dream. Standing at the window with her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, Maya watched the Columbia River catch fragments of moonlight like scattered promises. 6 months had passed since that fog-shrouded November morning when desperation had driven her to bid on Unit 47, and the woman who stared back at her from the window's reflection was someone she barely recognized. Transformed not just by motherhood, but by the impossible discovery that had resurrected her faith in miracles. The baby stirred, making soft sounds that seemed to harmonize with the acoustic recordings playing softly from Maya's laptop. Dr. Reeves had confirmed what Maya suspected. Her daughter's vocal development was incorporating frequency patterns from the extinct species, creating a unique linguistic foundation that bridged human speech with creature communication. The child would grow up trilingual, speaking English, scientific notation, and the resurrected voices of species that had found their way back from silence. Maya's reflection showed a woman whose eyes held depths that hadn't existed before Harold's journals entered her life. The desperate exhaustion that had driven her to storage unit auctions had been replaced by purposeful determination, the kind that came from understanding that her work mattered beyond personal survival. Every acoustic analysis she completed brought humanity closer to comprehending what it meant to guide extinction in reverse. The apartment around them told the story of transformation in careful details. Harold's photographs now hung in frames beside Maya's research certifications, creating a gallery that honored 30 years of patient documentation alongside the scientific revolution it had enabled. David's marine biology textbooks sat beside Harold's field journals, their combined wisdom forming the foundation for discoveries that neither man had lived to witness, but both had made possible. Torres emerged from the kitchen, carrying tea and settling beside Maya's research station with the comfortable familiarity of chosen family. A transition from federal agent to conservation coordinator had been as profound as Maya's own evolution. Protection taking new meaning when the subjects being guarded represented humanity's capacity for redemption rather than bureaucratic interests. The initiative approved funding for 7 additional sites. Torres said quietly, respectful of the sleeping baby. Harold's coordinate system identified enough suitable locations to establish a Pacific-wide network. Every creature you've learned to communicate with will have multiple sanctuaries. Maya smiled, feeling Harold's ghost approve from whatever realm Hunter's spirits inhabited when their final quarry turned out to be hope itself. His legacy had expanded beyond anything his solitary documentation could have achieved, transformed by collaborative human dedication into a conservation revolution that would ensure extinct species never faced extinction again. The baby opened her eyes, focusing on Maya's face with intelligence that seemed to carry genetic memory from David's scientific curiosity. Maya saw her husband's passion for discovery reflected in their daughter's alert expression, combined with her own stubborn refusal to accept defeat when miracles hung in the balance. "Your father would have loved hearing them sing," Maya whispered to her daughter, remembering David's excitement whenever his research revealed unexpected patterns in marine behavior. The acoustic recordings provided a nightly lullaby that connected their child to discoveries that transcended any original dreams either parent had harbored. Maya returned to her research station, cradling her daughter while reviewing communication patterns from the newest facility. Each site was developing unique acoustic signatures as resurrected species adapted to their environments, creating a symphony of voices that proved extinction could be temporary when human determination refused to accept permanent loss. The laptop displayed tomorrow's schedule, consultation calls with international conservation teams, acoustic analysis of breeding pair communications, and collaborative research with marine biologists who were rewriting textbooks based on Harold's 30 years of secret documentation. Maya's calendar reflected a career that honored every sacrifice while building toward futures neither Harold nor David had lived to see. Torres prepared the evening meal while Maya updated research logs, their domestic routine a testament to how catastrophe could create family bonds stronger than conventional relationships. They were three survivors, woman, baby, and protector, whose lives had been rebuilt around shared commitment to defending miracles that exceeded every human expectation. As darkness settled over the Columbia River, Maya played the final recordings of the day. Her daughter settled against her chest with contentment that came from being surrounded by voices representing hope rather than loss, while Maya continued her acoustic analysis with the satisfaction of work that felt like prayer answered through scientific dedication. The apartment filled with peaceful sounds from creatures whose existence proved that love could guide evolution toward impossible outcomes. Harold's patient documentation lived in every communication pattern. David's scientific rigor influenced every research decision, and Maya's future stretched toward discoveries that would ensure their daughter inherited a world where resurrection remained always possible. Maya closed her laptop and stood again at the window, holding her sleeping daughter while watching moonlight transform the river into something luminous. The reflection showed not the desperate woman who had bought a hunter's storage unit, but someone whose life had been reconstructed around understanding that some mysteries were meant to be revealed, that hope sometimes required believing in voices that called across the boundaries between extinction and return. Her daughter would grow up knowing that human love could resurrect anything worth saving,